Good afternoon. So as you might guess, the topic has to do with the moon based on what is up on the screen. So I'm very excited to share this with you. I would mention that we have a couple of handouts, both online and in the room here, that you can avail yourself of. And one of them is the recently published Hebrew calendar appendices, and it's a relatively large document. I printed out some extra copies. They're up on the information table if you would like to have one. And if we run out, just let me know, and we'll be happy to print out some more on our high-speed printer and bring them with us to church in subsequent weeks. So the title of the sermon today is The Moon and the Moedim. Can holy days be postponed? Can holy days be postponed? The short answer is no. Actually, the postponement rules, as they are called, do not delay a holy day. Actually, they calibrate and align more closely with the heavenly signs that God created for that purpose. And I've studied into this over the course of the last couple of months, and I found it to be an extraordinary demonstration of God's faithfulness down to this time. So I'd like to share that information with you in the time that we share this afternoon. So I gave you the answer right away. But what I now want to do is to go through in detail to show you how to find that answer in the Word of Scripture, as well as some extra biblical information, but mostly Scripture. So let's begin at the beginning. We will be only looking at a small section of this big topic. I mean, obviously, the calendar is a big topic, as indicated by the large document that you have in front of you. And the Hebrew calendar and other calendars in particular have been a topic of confusion and contention at times, and it really doesn't need to be that way. And I hope to bring some clarity to this. So here's what we're going to look at today. Number one, how the moon and the Moedim feasts are connected. The feast is bracketed. Moedim is a word that is frequently translated feasts, including in Leviticus chapter 23, that lists all of them. But it means a time appointed. We'll get to that in a minute. And then the second thing is the issue of postponement rules of the Hebrew calendar. Actually, that term is, I consider, unfortunate, and as we will see, it is maybe more accurately, when you look at the function of the rule, it would be more accurately translated a leap day or an alignment. You know, we think about the leap year that we have with the Gregorian calendar, that would be another way of saying it. The third thing, and this really gets to the heart of the matter. You know, we can't postpone Saturday to Sunday, right? We would all agree with that. So then the question that is frequently asked, and I think legitimately so, if there is a postponement of a holy day, isn't that what we are doing? And again, the answer we will find is no. What the calendar does is to align more closely the holy day with in this case, the full moon. So the third point is, do these rules postpone the holy days away from the time appointed by the, quote, heavenly clock created by God for signs, seasons, and for days and years? That's from Genesis 1, verse 14. So we'll go back to that. In Genesis chapter 1, God has some very specific things to say about the functions of the great lights that he created. In verse 14, then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night. And then he gives the purpose. And let them be for signs, seasons, and for days and years. dropping down to verse 16, then God made two lights, two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made stars also. So that's verse 16. We're going to have a few Hebrew word studies as we go through here. If you notice, we have here Moedim and lights, which is a Hebrew word, ma'or, and it simply means a light, used for the sun and the moon. And there's another word we'll get to in a minute, used for the moon, that specifically delineates that it is the moon. So what we see here are three hierarchical categories of light. You have a great light, the sun. You have a lesser light, the moon. And then it says that God also made the stars. And they have their function as well. We will be focusing primarily today on the moon and its purpose as it relates to the holy days. Secondarily, the three lights also have a purpose that we read in Genesis chapter 1. The first one was signs, and it's a Hebrew word, ot. And these signs could be equinoxes, eclipses, other heavenly signs. For example, this word is used in Genesis where the rainbow is given as a sign of the covenant. Same word. This word is also used in Exodus chapter 31, verse 13, where the Sabbath is called a sign. So the stars and the moon and the sun are given for signs, number one. Number two is Moedim, my appointed feasts. So you have seasons, and then days and years, using the Hebrew word yom. And this word is used throughout the first chapter of Genesis. Remember, it talks about for each day, actually for every day except the Sabbath, which is an interesting topic in itself. When God concluded the creative acts of the day, he said, and evening evening and morning were the first day. So what that does, and it's very important, is that the day, according to the Bible, begins in the evening and ends the following day. And he says that in every single case. There's part of the confusion is that we've had all different types of calendars. The Gregorian calendar, the day starts when? Midnight. 12 o'clock midnight is when the day starts. There are those who actually, one of the latest ideas that I've heard is that the biblical day starts at dawn and is from morning to morning, which is a misguided interpretation of Scripture, because it's very clear here in Genesis that it goes from evening and morning. It starts in the evening. And then finally, years. So we have the word sana, and an example of usage is in Exodus chapter 12, verse 2. And this is a key scripture with regard to the holy days. In Exodus chapter 12, the Israelites were still in Egypt. And God spoke to Moses and said, the first month of the year should be Abib. And he had to do that because otherwise they wouldn't have known when the 10th day is to take the lamb that they would be able to prepare the Passover. The Hebrew words here for the month is Kodesh, and the year is Sanah. Now the word Kodesh is a Hebrew word that is used frequently with respect to the month that we'll be looking at as we go along. Okay, so we get back to Hebrew word studies. So here the first word here is moed, or the plural form is moedim. And it says here that properly it is an appointment, a fixed time or season, specifically a festival, conventionally a year, by implication an assembly as convened for a definite purpose. So as with many Hebrew words, it has multiple meanings, the primary one being an appointment. And I think this is important because, if we had an appointment with a world leader, or if we have an appointment for a business, I get there early. I want to make sure that I'm on time because to not do so would be disrespectful. And of course, if you're a lowly salesman, if you show up late for the meeting, you're out of luck. I mean, you just get blown off. And I think it is interesting, God made appointments with us throughout the year. We have to decide whether or not we actually show up when he made the appointment, or we miss it. And then we have the Hebrew word yom. And in the context that we are using it, it means a 24-hour day. It can also mean an epoch or a time period, but the focus that we're looking at today is the 24-hour period. And then we have the Hebrew word kodesh. And I want you to make careful note of this because this word is used throughout the Bible, and it basically means two things. It can mean the new moon, when the new moon appears at the beginning of the month, or it can refer to the entirety of the month. So with that word we will look at a few more times as we go through this message, but just bear that in mind. It can mean a new moon, or it can mean a month. And then we have the word sanah, and this is simply the Hebrew word for year, and it means the course of the sun or of the changes of season, as in spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And it can mean a circle. So it is a full revolution, the entirety of the year, through all the different equinoxes that we have from that the sun sets, or I should say that the sun determines. I was talking to someone, and you have the spring and the fall equinox, and there's actually a really simple way to determine when the equinox is, other than from a calendar. You take a pole and put it in your backyard, and then when the sun comes up, you might have a pole that's, 6 or 8 feet tall. I think I'm going to do this just for fun. So when the sun comes up, you mark the end point of the shadow. And then when the sun is about to set, you mark the shadow on the opposite end. And when the spring or the fall equinox happens, that will be a straight line between the 3 points. I thought, that would be an interesting science experiment. You'll be able to look at it. Of course, we don't have to do that because it's all calculated out and you can just look at the calendar. Okay, now I have these blank slides in here so that you can know that we are moving kind of from one section to the other. So the moon and the Moedim of the Lord. Here is a passage of scripture from Psalms. It's Psalms 104:19. And it makes a simple statement. He appointed the moon for seasons. And at first glance, the full impact of that meaning is not apparent. So we have, for the word appointed, is the Hebrew word asah. And for the moon, here's the specific Hebrew word for the moon, yariah. And seasons then is Moedim, which we've talked a little bit about already. But I'd like to just spend a few minutes on a couple of these words. Yariah is the Hebrew word that is used throughout to refer to the moon. And so you could think of it this way. Yariah is the moon that gives light. Kodesh is the resulting phenomenon, if you will, or the resulting calendar event. It can mean the new moon or the approximately 30 days that a lunar month, actually 29 and a half is, to be more precise. And then the word asa, I think this is important because when you say, okay, I'll just slide back to the scripture, he appointed the moon for seasons. And when we think in English that, you appoint somebody, you kind of point over there to Jeff and say, hey, I appoint you to take care of tearing down the stage after services. This has much deeper meaning. It means to make. Now, I didn't make Jeff, right? But I can appoint him to do something. But in this case, what this really means is that God made the moon specifically for Moedim, to determine the times appointed. And, actually the commentator here, it says in German, Gold und Silber arbeiten, or sorry to stutter here, I'm looking at the notes here. It also uses the word machen, schaffen, which what happens, what the psalmist is saying here is actually referring back to the scripture in Genesis chapter 1, verse 16. And I think it's important here to note how coherent the scriptures are, because the psalmist refers back and echoes what God said in Genesis chapter 1. Then God saw two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made stars also. So it's the same word, except that the psalmist says that the moon was specifically for Moedim. So when we read in Leviticus that on the first day, on the 15th day of the first month, the days of unleavened bread start, or on the 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. It connects right back to. It's counting from that new moon up until a particular time. And God created the moon for that purpose. So here's what we learn from that. He appointed, or made, more accurately stated, the moon for Moedim. Number one, God created the moon to establish the time appointed for the feast on a specific day of the month. And we are commanded to convoke and to appear before the Lord on those days. So it's pretty important, and as we'll see here when we get closer to the conclusion, the thing that I found amazing is the accuracy with which you can calculate 1,000 years in advance, because God is faithful. The moon in its orbit, and all of that just works. We can set our watch to when the sun comes up in the morning, or when the moon sets or the moon comes up, and you can calculate that out years in advance. Next section. So here we have the classic scripture and the codified listing of the appointed times of the Lord. Leviticus chapter 23 and in verse 2. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocation, these are my feasts, my appointments with Israel, with you, with us, down to this day. So if you look at Leviticus chapter 23, and I'll show you a chart here in a minute, because we're going to look at the list, not all of them. You practice, you know what they are. But we'll also show a chart to delineate between two different types of feasts. These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. That's Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 4. And then, you have the whole listing. You go down through the list. We'll look at a few of them here. In verse 5 it says, on the 14th day of the first Kodesh. On the 14th day of the first Kodesh, at twilight is the Lord's Passover. That's a time appointed. But in contrast to the Sabbath, which is also in this list, the Passover is not a holy day. It's not a Sabbath rest. But it's still a Moedim. It's a time appointed that God expects us to show up at a certain place in a certain way to meet with him. You see, God's presence is there in these days. He sent us, as it were, a Outlook appointment. Most of you get those. I get a whole and I have to accept them. You click accept, and then it's on your calendar. If you decline it, it doesn't get put on your calendar. And I look at this and I say, okay, we have Moedim. God sends us a request to meet. He wants us to show up and meet with him. And we can either do like we do in Outlook, accept, or decline. And most people decline it. Or there's another option in Outlook, there's another option that you can reschedule, propose a new time. That doesn't work so well with God. I mean, he set the time, and we get to choose whether or not we accept it. That option's not available, I guess, is a good way of saying it. Verse 6, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread. To the Lord 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. Now, did you notice? There's a little bit something different here. We introduce a new word. So on the 15th day, Yom, of the same Kodesh, is the feast, but this time it's Hag. It's translated from the word Hag instead of the word Moedim, but it's a feast. It's also an appointed time, because it's in that list of appointed times, but there's a distinction, and this will become important a little bit later when we look at another psalm in the Psalms with regard to using the moon to establish certain days. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread is a Hag. And the Hag is also a feast. There's a lengthy definition here, but I've just focused in on one aspect of it. There are 3 Hags in a year, and we'll look at them in a minute. So this is what is also known as a pilgrimage feast, as you can see here from Brown, Driver, and Briggs' lexicon. Here we have Deuteronomy 16, verse 16. I mean, how many we've heard that scripture many, many times. It says here, 3 times in a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord in the place which he chooses. At the feast, Hag of unleavened bread, at the feast, Hag of weeks, Pentecost. So Pentecost that we are observing here in just a little bit over a week is one of these Hags. And at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. So all Hags are Moedim, but not all Moedim are Hags. You get that? Well, I have a handy-dandy chart here. So here is a list of Moedim, times appointed, from Leviticus chapter 23. You have the Sabbath. That's an appointed time. You count 7 days, and then you have the Sabbath. And just this is a side note, the Sabbath is the only day on the calendar that is not connected to the sun or the moon. You simply count. And I find it really interesting that the entire world still has a 7-day week. They've tried other things, but it doesn't work. And that time has not been lost all the way down through time. Now, we've been trying. Europe adopted a different 7-day week. The first day of the week is Monday now in Europe since the 1970s. And I was at a business leadership lunch in Sugar Creek a couple of weeks ago, and I noticed in the back they had a calendar, like a daily planner in the handout they gave me, and they also had Monday as the first day of the week. So I thought, oh, that's a new innovation for our community. But the 7-day cycle has not been lost. So in one sense, all the countries, China and everybody else included, they still have a 7-day week. They are inadvertently acknowledging what can only be found in Genesis chapter 1, that God spoke that or created it into existence by example. So we have the Sabbath. Then we have the Passover on the 14th Yom of the first Kodesh. And then we have unleavened bread on the 15th day. And then we have Pentecost, which you have to count 50 days until the morrow after the Sabbath. And then we have trumpets, which is on the first day of the 7th month. And we have atonement on the 10th day of the 7th month, and the Feast of Tabernacles on the 15th day, and then finally the 8th day. So this is the listing of all the Moedim. It's right there in Leviticus chapter 23. I should have put Leviticus chapter 23 on here, but I didn't. Now notice this. Here are the hogs. Okay? So we have unleavened bread, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles in both columns. This is important, or will become important here in a couple of minutes, but I just thought putting it in tabular form like that might make it easier to understand. Okay, we'll go to the next section, and we introduce the trumpets, because the Feast of Trumpets is the first day of the 7th month, and it also begins what is called the civil year. The religious year begins at the first month which is now called Nisan, in the spring of the year. So there is a memorial of blowing of trumpets. Psalm 81, verses 3 and 4. Now I'm going to preface what I'm going to say here, that there's controversy about what this psalm means. And the reason there is controversy is people with different opinions wanted to say different things, right? So I'll tell you what some of those things are, and you can go and Google and fact check this. And then I will give you why I believe the translation that we have here in this case, the New King James, is actually accurate, and the reason why, and it ties back to that distinction between Moedim and Hag. But let's just read this and ignore all that for a moment. Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon on our solemn feast day, for this is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. Okay? So now let's take a look at some of the underlying Hebrew words here. We have blow the shofar, okay, the ram's horn. And, the ram's horn, and then you have the 2 silver trumpets. There's a lot of blowing of trumpets. There's a lot of noise and celebration. And in some cases, these are used interchangeably. But so this is it says here that this is in command form in Psalms, but verse 4 says that it is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob. Okay? So we blow the shofar at the time of the new moon. So there are new moons, obviously, throughout the year, either 12 of them or in some cases 13 when a 13th month is intercalated. And then the next statement, it says, at the full moon on our solemn feast day. And here's where the controversy comes in. This word keza is only used one time in the Old Testament in connection with the moon. It's used a second time in a little bit different form in Proverbs, where you have the cheating woman come out and say, hey, come in with me, my husband is gone, and he'll come back at the time appointed. But it's a different version of the word. The controversy here is whether this should be translated full moon or new moon. New King James translated it new moon. The the majority of translations translate it full moon. The reason some people argue for new moon is because they want this to say that the new moon is at the conjunction, which means that there is absolutely no visibility of the moon. That's really not our topic today. But here's why that can't be true. There is no new moon that's also a hog. Remember that? There are two hogs that are full moons. One is the first day of unleavened bread. The other one is the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles. And it says here that blow the trumpet at the full moon on the feast day that is a hog. So it cannot mean, in this case, this cannot refer to a new moon. That's mentioned earlier. That's the Kodesh, right? So that's important, an important distinction with respect to the establishment of the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the feast. And here's Numbers 10:10. If you look at Numbers 10, it's a whole chapter about trumpets. You have the two silver trumpets, and the priests blow it, and they sound the advance, and they do all these different kinds of things. So I won't go into that, but I do want to read this. Also, in the day of your gladness, in your appointed feasts, Moedim, at the beginning of your month, Kodesh, you shall blow the trumpets. It's a different word. It's referring to the silver trumpets. So the question is, what do you blow, a silver trumpet or a ram's horn? And I think the honest answer, as we will see here in a minute, is they use both, depending on what they did. Notice, in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 24, speak to the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the first day of the month, Kodesh, you shall have a Sabbath rest, a memorial of blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. The only problem is, as you see here, the word of trumpets is bracketed. You have a memorial of blowing, by implication, trumpets. So the emphasis is not on the instrument, but rather on the noise it makes. And this is the Feast of Trumpets. Continuing, here is the conclusion. We conclude now this section. In Leviticus chapter 23, in verse 37, Moses concludes like this: these are the feasts, these are the appointed times of the Lord, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations. And I put the chart back in here. We have the list and the distinctions between the different ones. Okay. We go to the next section. Are you with me? Are you asleep? Nah, you're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Okay. Too much technical information? Well, you can ask questions afterwards. So the good part, stay awake here, because the good part is yet to come. We're about to get there. So now we get to this issue of the Hebrew calendar postponements of the full and the new moon. So without going into Well, maybe I'll go into a little bit of detail just by way of background. There is a rule that I must say sounds really archaic, and that is if the molad of Tishri, which is the first day of the 7th month, if it falls on a Sunday, Wednesday, or a Friday, you move it a day. And until I studied into this, I always thought that's kind of weird. Why would you do that? And some of the reasons that are given are, well, you would have double Sabbath in the fall, and if the Day of Atonement falls on a Friday, you can't prepare for the Sabbath. Okay, all of that may be plausible, but I want to focus today on the astronomical reason, the calibration reason, the leap day, if you will, reason. And just here's a bonus point. The bonus point is this. Go look at Leviticus, and I found this interesting. The term Sabbath rest is only used referring to the fall holy days. The question is why? I'm not sure why, but I'll give you an opinion from the 5th book of John, okay? The fall holy days are not yet fulfilled. That's a fact. That's not John's opinion. Remember in Hebrews chapter 4, there's a statement that says, there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That is something that is yet to come, and I find it really interesting that, at least at this point, that is not fulfilled, and there's that distinction. And actually, if you are so inclined to read the 120-page paper, there's a little bit more detail on that. Okay, so we got this issue of postponing the Molad of Tishri. And what happens is you move the civil new year by either a day or 2 days in some cases, and then the whole calendar moves. It's not like you just move one day. The whole calendar moves. So there are always I think I'm doing this from memory, 177 days between the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the feast. That never changes, okay? So you move it a day or 2 based on these quote-unquote postponement rules. So you think about it, you move it 2 days, that's a lot. So we'll look now at the feasts and the holy days and the fullness of the moon. And this is what I found as an engineer. I did these calculations, and the calculations aren't hard. It's just addition and subtraction. It's not calculus or anything complicated, but fascinating nonetheless. So here we have the three holy days that we want that factor into this equation. We have the first day of unleavened bread on the 15th of Abib, and that's a full moon. And then we have the Feast of Trumpets, which is the 1st of Tishri, and that's a new moon. And then we have the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, which is the 15th of Tishri, which is a full moon. And if you note in the notes there, 2 of them are a Hag, and 1 of them is just a Moed. And if you go back to Psalms 83, you see how that connects and how that is relevant. So the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles is a Hag that falls on the full moon. And as we have seen in the Torah, as well as in Psalms chapter 81, it is a statute for Israel and a law of the God of Jacob. So the question is, when you postpone these days, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we can't really change this because that's what it's called on the calendar, but postponement, when I hear postponement, what do you think? I think, well, I mean, we can't get to it today, right? So you just postpone it a day or two until we can get to it, right? You might as well say we're going to delay it, which, I can understand why that is something that people become concerned about. So the question is, since the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the feast are full moons, and that is a law of the God of Jacob, it's pretty easy to do a little bit of a test here, right? Does the full moon fall, is the moon full on the postponed day or on the unpostponed day? So that was the fun I had. I went and calculated it backward all the way to 1978, which is a little bit more than 2 19-year time cycles. And I'll show you the answer. Or, as I told you in my short answer, do they calibrate the holy days to align with the heavenly light created by God to establish the feasts of the Lord in their appointed times? So, just to do some quick math, we know that the year currently is 365 and a fraction of a day. That's how long it takes. And we also know from history that that was already the case at the time of Moses. So this is not a new phenomenon. We also know, if you read the account in Genesis during the flood, it appears that at the time of the flood, the year was 360 days. What we don't know is when it changed, okay, or why it changed. What we do know is you have 365 days. So you do a little bit of, math, and the Hebrew calendar is either 354 or 355 days long. So you're short by 10 days, roughly. So you go down, you do this for 3 years, and what they do is to put in a leap month, right? So that makes up for the 3 years of 10 days short. Just like we do. I mean, this is not something new or peculiar. All calendars have to do that. We do that every 4th year in February. We add an extra day to keep the Gregorian calendar lined up. But even by doing that, it doesn't make up for the other fractions. So you have to add a day or two to keep things in their season as God has commanded. Otherwise, you'd have a calendar that works like the Muslim calendar. You ever notice that Ramadan goes throughout the entire year? It just keeps circulating because they have a calendar that doesn't realign, and the days just keep circulating through. That wouldn't work with the purpose and even the spiritual meaning, okay? In the spring, you have to have a sheaf of barley to do the wave sheaf offering, right? So you have to have the calendar adjusted so that the holy days fall in their season, okay? So this is an issue of calibration. The question is, can we test this year by year? This is the good part. I've been teasing this, and we're getting there, okay? So here, this year, or rather last fall, the Molad of Tishri was pushed by 1 day because of the postponement rule, right? So the moon, if you ever watch this, you have the full moon, and you go 1 or 2 days before or after, you can really see, it takes a big slice out of it. This is one of those years. So this year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread 2023, here's what the postponed moon looked like. If you were out celebrating the night to be much observed, the moon on the night to be much observed was 99.7% full at moonrise in Jerusalem. Okay, all of these numbers are based in Jerusalem. And actually, this year I looked in Sugar Creek, it was some similar number, but it depending on where you are on the face of the earth, it will be a little bit different. But the calculations I gave you here are Jerusalem. So that's what the moon looked like. It It was a great evening. I don't know if you were out and about, but great full moon. Bright, big, it's that festival moon. There's something about that that's I've always found inspiring. The day before would have been the unpostponed day. That's what the moon looked like. The day before, had we not postponed it, I don't like to use that word, because it wasn't that we quote unquote postponed it, the calendar moved it by one day so that it works out to be the full moon. Okay? The same, of course, will be true this fall. So this is the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, 2023. Postponed moon on the eve of September 29th at moonrise, 99.9% full. On the 15th of Tishri on the Hebrew calendar. The unpostponed moon on September 28th will only be 99% full. I found this to be extremely fascinating. Okay? To me, it's a demonstration of God's faithfulness. And also the accuracy. The accuracy of the Hebrew calendar has been under assault for time immemorial. And I'll give you, when we sum it up here in a few minutes, I'll give you an example of that. And, go knock yourself out. It's kind of my opinion. But, people much smarter than I have looked at this down through time for years. Actually, if you go to our paper, I can't remember the exact amount, but now that we have NASA and you have satellites and all of the ability to measure sunrise and sunset and the movements of the planets out to 20 decimal places, however they do that, I can't remember the difference, but it's only what NASA has actually measured is way out many decimal places on what the Hebrew calendar has had for years. So one of the things that the ancients paid a lot of attention to, and they needed to, because it was for agricultural purposes. Whether it's Stonehenge or the Mayans or the Babylonians or any of these. They did it for two reasons: agricultural purposes, and also because they worshipped the heavenly bodies as gods instead of using them to establish the holy days to worship the real God. They had these things figured out. So we'll go to the next slide. So in order to do this calculation, here's what I did. I took the average of the first day of unleavened bread and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles to take a look and go backwards, because you have to it has to take into consideration both of these days. So here's what 2023 looks like. The postponed moon for 2023 is 99.8% full. The unpostponed moon is 98.2%. Again, these are actual two-scale representations that I took off of a screenshot of a program that I will show you in a minute. So here's how it's calculated. There's a app out there, so you can go verify the numbers. It's a program called MoonCalc, and it's the fullness of the moon in percent. It's calculated at moonrise on the eve of the holy day as it appears in Jerusalem. And then somebody will ask, why moonrise? Well, it approximates sunset, when the moon comes up, and that's what you would see as you're keeping the feast. I will admit, just because, I don't know, I'm an engineer or anal, what I had done is I took a data point at moon rise, moon set in the morning, and the midpoint in between, and averaged that out, but it came out to the same answer, materially the same answer. So to simplify it, I just used moonrise. So does it always work? That was, I did this for 2023 because it was relevant, and I thought, this is interesting. I wonder if it always works. So I went backwards 5 years, and it worked. And I went back 5 more years, and it worked. And then eventually I just plowed through it and went all the way back to 1978. And the postponement rules, while they may cite reasons of convenience, and I think this is why people have problems with it, just because some rabbi said it's not convenient to have 2 adjacent Sabbaths, what does that mean to me? Fair enough. But I believe, and this is from the 5th book of John, I believe that the people that made these rules obviously knew a lot more on the reasons why, and the real reason, I believe, is to make an alignment. In any case, whatever the reason, we can be very confident about the celebrating feasts on the days we do because it aligns very closely with the actual full moons, and it goes back, as I said, I went back to 1978. The postponements are essentially leap days to calibrate the Hebrew calendar to the full moon. So here's 2023, 2021, 2020, and I have a few handouts. I think Austin has a PDF of it as well that's going to get uploaded, so you can, I have a handout that goes back a number of years, and then there's a table that you can look at. It's not insignificant. If you look at, I like statistics, on average, starting in 1978 through 2023, the full moon, on average, is 99.14% full, according to the Hebrew calendar. If you drop the postponements, it's 97.87. That's material, as you'd say in statistics. So this table that I handed out and that will be uploaded gives you the number of days it was postponed. So here's an interesting, just as an aside, in 2020, the postponement rules moved the day 2 days. After pushing it 2 days, the moon was 99.3% full. If you hadn't moved it 2 days, it would have been 97.35. It's a law of the God of Jacob, and it still works today. You can calculate this now down to the second. Actually, the program that I mentioned, if you want to know when the moon rises, it goes out to decimal points of a second, and it always works. So I'd like to sum it up with 2 points. This is what this meant to me. God is faithful. The heavenly lights created for Moedim still tell us when to observe his appointed times with accuracy that can be calculated years in advance down to the minute, actually to the second. So that was my takeaway. But there's a second sum up, if you will. And this is from the practice of the Apostle John. The assault on the Hebrew calendar is nothing new. There's a prophecy that they will attempt to change times and seasons. Okay? The Romans did that. The Germans, the European Union is doing it, changing the day of the week. So this is a quote from our paper, but it was quoted from a Dr. Irv Bromberg. And he says the following: in the Julian year AD 358, the Roman Emperor Constantine, which is Constantine's son, wanted to prevent Christians from determining when to celebrate the Passover by asking, choose when will be the date of the Passover. So this was still going on in the 4th century. The true Christians were still going to the choose to find out when the new moon was, in order to be able to observe the Passover and the other holy days. Now, by that time, they'd become a minority. But this was important enough to the Romans that this is what they did. So he outlawed new moon announcements by the Jewish Sanhedrin with the intent of squashing the Hebrew calendar. Up until this time, the rules and the arithmetic of the Hebrew calendar were a closely guarded secret. And when the Sanhedrin learned that they were going to do this, they made it publicly available. And the way to make it publicly available is Hillel II sent out his trusted mathematicians, I guess he would call them, to different parts of the Jewish dispersion, and made this information publicly available. So the Romans came and shut down the Sanhedrin. But the information had already escaped. What about the Apostle John? This is a letter this was a disagreement in Asia, a letter that Polycrates, who was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John, wrote to the bishop in Rome because they wanted them to keep Easter. Here's what he wrote, quote, and I'm reading excerpts because you can go online and get all the details, but I'm reading an excerpt. We observe the exact day, neither adding nor taking away, for in Asia also great lights have fallen asleep, which shall rise again on the day of the Lord's coming. Among these are Philip, one of the 12 apostles. Moreover, John, my namesake, right? Moreover, John, who was both a witness and a teacher, who reclined on the bosom of the Lord, and being a priest, wore a sacerdotal plate, he fell asleep at Ephesus, meaning died, and Polycarp in Smyrna, who was a bishop and a martyr. All these observed the 14th day of Passover according to the gospel, deviating in no respect by following the rule of faith. So here's my takeaway. If that calendar, and that reckoning, I should say, was good enough for the Apostle John, it's good enough for this John. So we're going to have a Q&A, if you want to, about 15 minutes after services. Okay, are we ready to start? All right, here's how it's going to work. Mark Miller has a microphone, so we're recording this for the benefit of others who may want to listen in later. So if you have a question regarding the sermon, that's I guess where we should start on the sermon itself. If you have other questions regarding the Hebrew calendar, I'll try to answer it if I know the answer. If I don't, I'll just say I don't know. So if you can, if you have a question, just raise your hand and Mark will bring you the microphone.
Yeah, I just had a quick question on Hebrews 4, and you talked about the tie-in between the difference of the spring and the fall holy days, the command to rest. I thought that was interesting. If you could expand that a little bit, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify what I said, and what is factual is, if you look in Leviticus chapter 23, the fall holy days, starting with trumpets, atonement, first and last days of the Feast of Tabernacles, are delineated as Sabbath rests. That exact phrase is not used for the spring holy days, although they are holy convocations. It's just that that term is used for the fall holy days. So is that clear? Okay. And then the interesting thing is that in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 4, it says that there remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. I think the Greek word is sabbatismos, if I remember correctly. So you could conclude that since the fall holy days are not fulfilled in their spiritual sense, that somehow that connects with Hebrews chapter 4:4. So that's a little bit of speculation.
You made a comment about in Noah's days, the year being 360 days. So I was just curious about that, like how we know that, where that idea came from.
If you read the account of the flood, you can, by the number of days, you can determine that the year at that time was 360 days. Sometime after the flood, that changed. We do know that by the time of Moses, we already had a 365-day year. But what we don't know is when that changed. I mean, one could conclude that it changed during or after the flood, but I don't know that we know that.
So are they counting how long he was in the ark, or how are they getting the 360, I guess, to begin with?
There's an explanation of that in the appendix of the paper that goes into more detail that I can tell you off the top of your head, but top of my head, not your head, I'm sorry. So if you go look at the account in Genesis of the flood, it talks about the year being 360 days. And without going and reading it, I can't tell you precisely which verse it is.
On this handout, it mentions the 18-hour rule. What is that?
Yeah, actually, I didn't bring that up. Can somebody get me the handout, as there was one up here? Garrett, if you can also get me the appendix and the summary paper. I thought I had one up here. So on this sheet that I handed out, the calculations. Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, just in case. So in the notes and comments, we give you the reason for the postponement. So for example, this year it was the Sunday, Wednesday, Friday rule. You go down to 2020, you had a postponement of 2 days. One was the Sunday, Wednesday, Friday rule, and then the 18-hour rule. And it shows you here on Thursday that the Molad of Tishri was at 20 hours, so that's 2 hours beyond. So the 18-hour rule, and I'm going to use approximate terms here, if the Molad of Tishri occurs after 2 o'clock on the day, then they automatically push it one more day, postpone it by a day. That's the 18-hour rule. I think he has a follow-up.
I'm sorry. The 18-hour rule, does that start at 6 a.m.,
6 p.m.
6 p.m.? Okay. All right, thank you.
So, again, the molad of Tishri is the calculated average in accordance with the Hebrew calendar of the new moon on the first day of the seventh month. So if the new moon, which is the calculated average, falls on during, again, rather than using the 18-hour rule, if it falls in the afternoon after 2 p.m., which would be 18 hours after 6 p.m. the previous day, the molad of Tishri is then postponed by 1 day. Gwen has a question. Wait till the microphone comes.
John, would you repeat what you said about the 177 days?
Yeah, so the way the calendar works, the time between the first day of unleavened bread, which is a full moon, and the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles is always 177 days. Any more questions? Was I guess just for general feedback, was the presentation or the sermon, were you able to follow it? Was it clear? Nodding your heads, thumbs up. I mean, there's obviously, there are more details than I could go into. What I was trying to do is to provide a clear explanation for, honestly, I always had a little bit of an uneasy feeling about this quote-unquote postponements. I assumed that they were correct, but I didn't know why. And this for me at least, was very helpful to see how the rules that talk about postponing something, which, again, whenever I hear the word postpone, I think, well, we didn't have time or it wasn't convenient, you're going to move it a day. Just kind of gave me a little bit of an uneasy feeling until I saw this, that it's actually, another a term that I've used is that it's a leap day, and it actually lines it up closer to 2 of the full moons that fall on what the Bible calls a hog. Take one last question here.
As far as the postponements, do we know when those were introduced and who was in charge of it, and when did they start, I guess, calculating out years in advance when, the Hebrew calendar, now we can, I don't know how many years we can look in advance when the holy days are going to be. Do we know when it started and when the transition was for the postponements and all that?
Yeah, that's a great debate, and I'll answer it a couple different ways. This is one of those things, depending on what you want to prove, you can find a PhD that will agree with you, type of thing. But here's what I think is generally agreed upon. So we know that the Sanhedrin was empowered to make those calculations. We know that in the 4th century, the son of Constantine wiped out the Sanhedrin, and at that time, they were already doing postponements. There are some who argue that the postponement rules as they exist today really didn't come into full effect until the 11th or the 12th century. That's debatable. So your question was, when did they start calculating instead of observing? So there is indication in the Bible that it was being done as early as King David's reign, And I forget the scriptural reference, but there was a time when David was supposed to show up at the celebration of the new moon for Saul, and he makes some kind of forward-looking statement that in 2 days is the new moon. So if you did it by observation, they wouldn't have been able to know when it would be until after they observed it and then proclaimed it. So we know that at least at that time there was some method of calculation. There were, during the time of Christ, certainly by that time they had figured it out and were calculating. So then the question is, how do we know that? And the reason you'd know that is, for example, Paul makes numerous comments in Acts about wanting to attend a particular feast in Jerusalem. So it can be, depending on the new moon or the molad of Tishri, you can be 1 month apart, right? So he would have had to have known when it was in order to make travel plans. So I think the honest answer is that we know that it was being calculated early on, even in David and Saul's time. Those method of calculation probably kind of changed or evolved over time, if I may use that word. But the current postponement rules have certainly been in use as early as the 4th century. And what we do in the paper, and I think it's plausible, one of the other debates was the crucifixion in 31 AD or 30 AD. And there are people that will argue passionately for either one. We take the position that it was 31 AD, and we do that based on the fact that, 30 and 31 AD, depending which calendar you use, the crucifixion could have been on Wednesday in 30 AD. It could have, and it would have been in 31 AD. But we also, the Gospels do record on which day Jesus kept certain feast days. And if you line that all up, the only combination that works is a 31 AD crucifixion. And it also takes into account, it also only works if you use the postponements that we are currently using today. So we take the position in the paper that Christ and the apostles observed the holy days based on postponements. Now, there are people that will argue against that, okay? But I think this paper does a good job. I had my only contribution to it was being part of the editing process and then doing this table, which I had a lot of fun with, and it was kind of a late addition to it. So there was a lot of work done over a long period of time, and it's a way better paper than the previous one that we had. So now that it's published, it's been on the website for a couple of weeks. I'm sure we're going to get feedback, and that's okay. People pick at it, and we can make edits to it as necessary. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you.